One of the amazing attributes of our modern world is how we've been able to abstract complexity. We don't spend too much effort worrying about how electrons get to our sockets, and we don't worry about how the gas that we put in our cars is extracted, transported, refined, and we don't think about the myriad of systems that route package to our doorstep. The reality is that there's an amazing amount of complexity involved in shipping and logistics. To be able to collect, route, trace, deliver products involves countless interoperating systems and a lot of standardization. To make this industry work efficiently, companies have to work together to solve common problems through a process referred to as Coopetition. I'm Dale Chrystie. I'm the Chief Catalyst at BRI. Welcome back to another episode of W3B Talks, an ongoing exploration of the impact of AI, Web3, and blockchain technologies on business and society. In this episode, we're going to look at the ideas and rationale behind Coopetition. To help us navigate this topic, we are joined by Dale Chrystie, who is a business fellow and blockchain strategist at FedEx. Welcome to the podcast, Dale. How you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I am fine. Now, this is a topic that is kind of near and dear to my heart because I spent a fair amount of my career involved in the standards world and working with groups of companies trying to forge common standards. And I always found it very interesting as we walked into a standards meeting, we'd have to kind of check our own company credentials at the door, so to speak, so that we could figure out how to work with each other in order to create a larger and healthy marketplace in which we all could participate and collectively create value. And yet you always had in the back of your mind that the people sitting around the table with you are competitors, right? They're people from other companies. So I've been fascinated by this topic, and you wrote a wonderful paper for BRI on Coopetition not too long ago. And so I thought it'd be great to sit down and have a conversation with you about your perspectives on this. But even before we get into all of that, what's your story? How did you come to this space and decide that this was an area that you wanted to focus on?
Well, I stumbled into it, I think, is the short answer, but I'll give you a little bit longer answer, which is I led the first blockchain use case at FedEx in late 2017, mid 2017. By 2018, we built a global supply chain blockchain. And at that point, everyone was kind of trying to treat blockchain like the internet and get rich quick. And only after we built it did we realize that, yes, it works, but it won't scale. We go to 220 countries and territories. We basically go everywhere you can go on the globe at this point in time. So our default position is essentially the International Space Station. And at that level, there is no company, there's no industry, there's no borders. Data knows no geographic borders. So in that case, we had this blockchain. We didn't think it would scale, but under what set of circumstances might it scale? Well, if we could kind of envision ourselves gathered in this global virtual conference room, and the only price for admission was for everybody to agree on an Apache or an MIT or some other open source license, we felt it could scale globally. And so we had to get to the word open, both internally and externally, by the way. And so, yeah, we're in business to be in business, but none of us can skip over what we believe will be an open foundational layer to jump ahead and monetize this. Once the open layer exists, there'll be all kinds of proprietary layers, services, solutions, and all those kinds of things offered. So that's why I say it will take a pro-competitive global village, a Coopetition, to scale blockchain, Web3, and these emerging technologies. And so I guess to finish that point, as it relates to emerging technologies like blockchain and others, to me, Coopetition is both inevitable and necessary.
You started to touch on my next question, which is, can you define Coopetition? And it's part of the definition is implicit in the word itself. And I suspect it varies a little bit from my experience in the standards world to the world that you're describing, because I think that blockchain and the idea of having common state engines that multiple players can interact with is actually almost a new and slightly different sort of variation on the theme. But in your world, in the shipping logistics world, can you just define with some degree of precision what you mean by Coopetition?
And by the way, I will say this while we are founding members of the Blockchain Research Institute and proud founding members, this is not limited to blockchain. This is not limited to Web3. Coopetition is a concept that is all around us. And so it was interesting to me when I started researching this paper to find other examples that have absolutely nothing to do with blockchain and may have been almost 200 years ago or even more from that point of view.
Just to put some color on this, give us one of those examples.
Coopetition is kind of a provocative word, right? It's not a typical word. I was trying to get to something as I was doing conferences and presentations and things like that that would be kind of memorable, that would kind of stick in people's mind. And so originally, once we got to this open concept, I don't know, 2017 or something, started referring to blockchain as a team sport. And then I kind of moved over into coopetition. I happened onto that word and was like, this is a good word because hopefully it will linger with people. Hopefully people will go, well, wait a second, what's up with that? I would tell you that the concept goes back to the 1700s. So you've got two businesses, Doug and Dale in Glasgow, Scotland, and we might be fierce competitors. And under what set of circumstances might we agree? We would agree that, well, Doug wants to sell this to you or Dale wants to sell this to you. But if neither one of us can sell it to you, we'd rather you buy it from one of us than to go to London to buy this. And so that gets into this whole kind of duality of, yes, we're competitors, but we also could cooperate or find agreement, find areas of agreement in some cases. So back to your original question, can you define coopetition? My definition of coopetition is it's not about where we compete, it's about where we can agree. And so even fierce competitors can agree that something like reducing friction across borders, delays, paperwork, resources, etc., is not only a win for those competitors, but it's also a win for consumers and global commerce.
Just to be clear, we're not talking about carving up territory and saying instead of beating each other to death, you take the north part, I'll take the south part, and we'll just enjoy. You're talking about actually working together and helping each other to execute our respective business models because it's in our collective interest. Is that right?
Antitrust is a law. Those are laws. That's a hard line in the sand, and nobody should cross it, and we don't cross it. Just to put that harder point out there from that point of view. And yet, in the last 5 years or so, I've really kind of, my experience has been that most people stop right there. Most people say, well, this is FedEx or UPS or FedEx or DHL or other examples. Pick any examples you want to pick of competitors. And they simply say, well, that's a competitor. Oh, we can't do that. We can't do that, whatever. To put a finer point on that, I think that most people treat this kind of binary, which is where do you compete and where do you differentiate? Again, I'll stick within my own industry. FedEx, UPS, DHL. Where do we compete? Well, we all go to 220 countries and territories, and we all have various things. Where do we differentiate? That's a much longer conversation, right? We do this, they do that, the other ones do this. That's a whole conversation from that point of view. And traditionally, to include legal departments, they stop right there. They pump the brakes hard and come to a full stop. Whereas from my point of view in coopetition, it's really about not where we compete, but where can we agree. So if we flip it around and say, under what set of circumstances could FedEx, UPS, DHL agree? Well, we proved that point at a BRI conference in 2019, where we calmly sat down, FedEx, DHL, UPS, sat down with Don Tapscott and just walked our way through where are the kinds of things that we could agree. And again, one of those is an example I just mentioned, which is where we can reduce friction across borders, delays, paperwork, resources. If we can do that, we win, our customers win, and global commerce also wins. So that gets you to things like standards, to your earlier point. That gets you to interoperability. And part of where this conversation needs to go, I believe, is that we need to all start thinking of this as a layer. So our first effort was incorrect. We tried to do what everybody else was doing in 2017. Let's just build this thing out. Let's put a logo on it and move it out there. That's when we realized we couldn't do it. But that also was a learning exercise for us to realize, wait a second, we think there's going to need to be an open foundational layer to this emerging technology. And once that is there, sequentially, once that is there, then many people will put proprietary layers on top of it. They'll have solutions and offerings and services and things like that. But we can't skip to the, okay, let's just go monetize it kind of a thing. And so the pro-competitive piece is the key piece here. What is pro-consumer? What is pro-competitive? And that gets you, I mean, we could talk about safety. We could talk about all kinds of things that are that and still wouldn't get anywhere near the antitrust or anti-competitive side of things.
I like the way that you've framed that as a layering. I remember when I was going into standards meetings, we would start every standards meeting with an anti-competitive statement. And sometimes we'd even have a lawyer in the room that would go through this minute or 2 minute long introduction just so that everyone understood that there are things that we can and cannot talk about. But if you look back at any number of major, what I like to think of layering, I mean, think of electrical distribution systems or radio telecommunication systems or network switching systems. There's certain things that, yes, from an economic standpoint, you want competitors to compete with each other because that drives down prices and drives efficiency into the marketplace, and it's in the best interest of consumers. And yet there's certain layers that says, listen, if we can all agree on a certain cycle and voltage rate for electricity, if we can agree on a certain kind of encoding and certain set of defined frequencies for mobile communications, we can compete on the packaging of things or the telephones that we sell that plug into that layer. But having those layers actually is in the best interest of both business and consumers. So I really like the way that you phrase that. In your domain, in shipping and logistics, what are the equivalents of those layers that you and your erstwhile competitors work on together?
Standards, interoperability, things like that. Just going back for just a quick second, one of the things that struck me, and this is now maybe 5 years old as well, maybe 2019, the CEOs of the big three German auto manufacturers came out with a common statement that simply said the future of vehicles in Germany is electric. And by saying that, it doesn't sound like a big deal, but by saying that, what they really were saying is we're going to agree on the infrastructure, we're going to agree on the charging and all those kinds of things, but yet we will still compete at the model level. They're going to be electric. You build yours, I'll build mine, whatever the case may be. That wasn't any cue to the other competitor, hey, we're going to do something that's anti-competitive. Absolutely not. What they simply said was they abstracted that layer basically and said, look, it's all going to be electric. And once we get to that point, you do you and I'll do me and whatever the case may be. Yet the concept of coopetition is still not taught at most business schools. It's not taught your first week of new employee orientation. It's just not. And for good reasons, right? But for so long, people said, oh, that's antitrust, that's anti-competitive. And I had to argue internally as well and externally in many of my presentations, no, it's not. We fully respect that. It's a hard line in the sand. We are founding members of the BIDA Standards Council, where we're focused on open, harmonized global data standards, royalty-free data standards, et cetera, et cetera. And we still, to your earlier point, start with an antitrust statement. Why? Because that's the right thing to do. It is the right thing to do. But once we hit that hard line in the sand, there's actually a lot of area that we can all agree that's pro-consumer. And so back to your question, it's standards, right? These are going to be standards that are going to revolve around everything that we are talking about right now in terms of blockchain, in terms of Web3, in terms of these other emerging technologies. Interoperability is another key word that is going to have to work for everybody. Interoperability is not a proprietary thing. That's the open layer. That's the open, wait a second, back to your electrical example, we're going to build the grid behind the scenes, and we're going to put this little thing in your wall, and you can have a plug, and you can plug in a hairdryer, you can plug in a toaster, you can plug in anything you want because it will work. That whole logic of interoperability is also pro-competitive, right? It's a coopetition thing as well.
I think that makes total sense. I've always thought of standards as kind of having two kind of major flavors. There's this layer concept that says that we're going to define an entire substrate of a business, like electricity, telecom, all the examples we've already talked about. And then there's also the interface question that says if we're going to message to each other, that we'd better understand the language, the syntax, the formatting. And there's electronic equivalents of all of that that says that we're going to structure things in a certain way so that we can interact with them. And there's standards in healthcare and there's standards in various different kinds of business communications. As we look towards this emerging Web3 era, where it appears that we're going to have some new layers like blockchain common state engines and even constructs that sit on top of that, digital identity and wallets and healthcare records and all kinds of somewhat horizontal structures. The implication of all of that seems to be that businesses become much, much more composable, that it's something beyond the messaging interfaces that I'm going to send you an invoice or I'm going to send you a query of some sort or a work order, that our businesses are intertwined, intermingled, and that we now have access to this technology that allows them to be composed across entire ecosystems, that instead of having all of that integration happen inside of a company, it happens between companies. And we're going to have many more smaller economic actors that, because of their access to this infrastructure, are going to be able to compose themselves and behave as if they were bigger companies. Is there anything, that from your learning on doing all this research on Coopetition and through all your experiences, that as we project into this new world, that there are lessons learned that we're going to have to apply? And are there any holes? Are there any challenges that we're going to have to figure out and overcome in order to be able to realize the most benefit from this new era?
I think we've got a couple of 100 years worth of experiences. So my hope is that by learning from the past, by looking in the rearview mirror, we can realize that this is not a brave new territory, and we can lean into it more so. And that gets you to not only the C-suites, but the legal teams and everything else. Back to the paper, the 1800s, we've seen a lot of examples of this around the railroad industry. Doug had a track and Dale had a track that might have gone from the ocean, maybe a mile or something, up to the plant or something. And ultimately, when people started looking at this at an industry level, they realized that certain things were going to have to be agreed upon. Track width, for example. My track is a different width than yours is, therefore it's not interoperable. It's not going to work, right? We're going to have to figure out something that where we agree, because once you've put a mile of track and once I put a mile of track, if we have to unload everything and move it over to the other one, that's not all that efficient. So track width is one of the early things from that point of view. But as we work our way through that, now into the mid and late 1860s in the U.S., the railroads started having these conversations, which is, how do we expand? The country was growing. How do we expand? Well, track width was one of those things. But you get to all kinds of issues when you realize that if you have one track, you can only have one train on it. Therefore, we need some kind of communication requirements or processes set up to make sure that my train's not going in one direction and your train's not going in the other. And again, I could belabor this point with many more examples, but one of the things I found most interesting is that that's actually the origins of the time zones in the United States. Is during that period of time, the late 1800s, they realized that sundown for Doug is different than sundown for Dale. And sundown won't work as an arrival time or a departure time because of the globe, right? Because of the sunsets and all those things. So they proposed, and ultimately it was approved. And to this day, we still have the exact same time zones. And that all came out of an industry-led effort by the railroads in the maybe 1860s or so, something like that from that point of view. And then we repeat the process another 50 years later with the airline industry and the auto industry. And again, at an industry level, this all starts making sense very, very quickly. Once you understand I needed track width and I needed to establish time schedules so that we aren't doing certain things at the wrong times, then you move that forward to airlines, right? You don't want more than one airplane landing at the same time. You need a communication system. You need a common language. So if we kind of genericize some of these references, it's the same thing we're talking about now, more than 100 years later. We need a common language, we need processes, we need agreements, we need standards, et cetera, et cetera. Auto industry, same thing. Many of them, we had to establish roads, we had to establish certain ways that cars were made. Ultimately, you got to safety types of things that included seat belts and airbags and all kinds of things now that has been evolved from that point of view. The Coopetition piece is not new. And yet, here we are still in 2024 looking forward at this thing. And it's kind of a scary scenario here, but those were industry level efforts. railroad industry, air industry, auto industry. And those are industry level, not global level. The only global level effort we have seen is the internet. And the internet standards were established by a really small number of engineers and scientists at the time to make it human readable, to create these common languages, TCP/IP, HTTP, those kinds of things. And that's the first global technology that we've had. Now we move to the final point, which is blockchain Web3. Did not have that. We did not have a small number of really smart people creating these standards. It's out in the open at this point in time. And now we're trying to kind of catch up to that by establishing standards, by establishing some of these things. And now it's a more complex discussion around things like coopetition, where it's like, well, that's my competitor. My lawyer, my legal team is telling me not to talk to Doug because he works for some other company. So part of this becomes this education process and this, I've got to get used to it. I've got to be okay with the whole pro-competitive versus anti-competitive thing. So it's not really that intuitive. It's a longer, deeper discussion at this point, but it's going to have to happen for these emerging technologies to scale.
It occurs to me that when I was very involved in this world and working in the standards organizations, the people that had a variable sum mindset were much, much more productive than people that came to these engagements with zero-sum mindsets, that you have to kind of think beyond your own parochial point of view to the larger good and understand that you can actually make a bigger ocean and floats more boats and all that kind of stuff. One of the dynamics that I always found interesting, and sometimes it was a subtle thing and sometimes it was actually pretty overt, was that when I was engaged in a lot of these standards organizations, there was typically two communities. There was business people, typically executives from various different companies, and there was technical engineers that were doing a lot of the nitty-gritty of figuring out and debating which protocol would be structured what way and what the syntax would be, all that kind of stuff. But one of the most interesting things was that engaging in those environments exposed me to different points of view. There were people from different geographies, or sometimes they were direct competitors and sometimes they were adjacencies, or they were just other ecosystem participants that had a common interest in whatever it was that we were working on. And being in those rooms and engaged in those conversations, the idea flow that went back and forth and the ideas that it stimulated that were well beyond the ideas that my local team inside of my company, I was at IBM at the time, we would have these internal discussions, but we all had our own prejudices. We had our own blinders. We had our own collective experience and culture. Being involved in these coopetition engagements led to a new and different kind of innovation because it got us thinking about stuff in different ways. It exposed issues that we really hadn't considered because we were exposed to those other points of view. How important do you think the coopetition philosophy or methodology is to stimulating innovation? And in your experience, have you seen that kind of thing happen?
Yes, there are examples in the paper that talk about certain companies that have worked on a proprietary side of things together, right? McDonald's might work with Coca-Cola or something as a proprietary coopetition kind of a thing from that point of view. My focus on the paper was pro-competitive, right? Was literally the standards kind of thing that you've been talking about and those types of things. I'm much more familiar with those. An example of some of that would be during the pandemic in the United States. The world obviously was going through all kinds of things. And the way I would describe it is you and I could be arguing over our back fence about the hockey team or the favorite sports team, or whatever the case may be. And then during the pandemic, everybody dropped everything to try to find ventilators and PPE for people around the world that they'd never meet. That's coopetition. That's a fantastic example of coopetition. And so in the United States, just one example of that would be a thing that was called Project Warp Speed, which was a multi-entity effort to do all kinds of things. And by the time we got to the end, which resulted in vaccines, FedEx and UPS split the United States in terms of delivery. To speed up the delivery and to do that, we were all sitting at the same table with the government, with all the pharma companies, all the massive number of people involved that would have to put an effort that big together. And yet the end result was FedEx and UPS were right there together. And again, There's lots of examples. It's not a blockchain thing only. It's actually under what set of circumstances could you and I agree on something and be motivated to do something about it? And so, yeah, there are proprietary ways to work through coopetition, and there are examples of that. For me, the time that I spent is on the pro-competitive side. For these technologies to scale, it's going to have to be an open layer. It's going to have standards. It's going to have to be interoperable. Once we get to that point, it's a very different global commerce in the future. It looks very different.
I think you've just preempted my next question, which was, can you give me any tangible examples of areas where the efficiency has been improved or customer service or some outcome has been improved because of the coopetition interaction between you and many of your colleagues in your industry? I guess the Warp Speed project is actually a really tangible example that we can all relate to, because at some level we all benefited from the work that you guys were doing behind the scenes to just get the thing done.
I think that's right. And again, I think a lot of people would be surprised. I still remember Don Tapscott's reaction in 2019. He was on about every third panel. So he was on the stage a lot, and he had a whole staff that was trying to prepare him. Okay, here's your next panel. Here's your next questions. And he finally sat down on the stage, and I'm on that stage representing FedEx, and we had UPS and DHL. And it was the first time, to my knowledge, that had ever been done. And he finally kind of sat down and looked across this 3-person panel. And he's just like, I can't believe we're actually doing this. We're actually sitting here and I've got these 3 companies. And yet it actually happens a lot, more than most people realize. I represent one of these big global companies, and there are many other global companies. And we understand and we respect and appreciate the shadow that we cast, which is a global shadow. And for these things to occur, you have to work amongst a lot of other people. So there's a lot of great people that work in government affairs and all the rest of that stuff that work with governments, with regulatory agencies, with competitors on many of these kinds of things. We're focused right now on open and harmonized global standards. And to have a conversation like you and I are having could be me talking with somebody from one of the global agencies. There's more communication, I think, than a lot of people know. And certainly we all respect the laws and we respect the hard lines in the sand and all that kind of stuff. But there's a lot of people that really care deeply about moving some of these things forward, and they're doing great work behind the scenes to work together. And that can include competitors. It can include us working with, U.S. Customs or Department of Homeland Security or other examples of that around the world, et cetera.
It just led into my next question, which is wonderful. You mentioned this idea of harmonized global standards, and that is very much in the interest of most businesses to have a well-understood, well-regulated, commonly regulated backplane for business operations to minimize friction and increase predictability and all those sorts of things. The reality is, and this is certainly very obvious in the emergent and nascent Web3 space, especially the part having to do with finance and crypto assets, that the regulatory landscape is varied and very inconsistent, although I think it's fair to say that there have been some recent developments and that we are moving increasingly to some degree of normalization, give or take some sort of boundary conditions. How big a challenge is the variance in jurisdictions and the regulatory environment in different jurisdictions in this coopetition space? Let's work on the standards and all that, but is there any of we need to collectively lobby regulators to define some sort of collective common context for us to operate within? How do those two worlds intersect?
I can tell you that as far back as 2018, 2019, I would do a conference or a presentation or something, and we'd open it up for Q&A. And almost always, literally, the very first question was, that sounds really good. How are you going to get the government to go along? That's a valid question. I can tell you that as far back as 2019, we made a proposal to U.S. Customs about a progressive clearance concept, which is basically using data to clear. So we know that Doug is shipping something into the United States, and with a small amount of data, buyer, seller, country of origin, a few things like that, We thought we could streamline that dramatically, especially in the e-commerce space, which has proven to be true basically over the last 5 years with the pandemic and everything else that we've seen from that point of view. But I would tell you, in defense of U.S. Customs, Department of Homeland Security in the U.S., they get it. They have a 21st century framework that is exactly where this whole thing is going around the word digital. And so their primary framework, which is called ACE, the next iteration of ACE 2.0, will be credential. To translate that to whoever's listening here, if you don't get that code reference, that's a digital identity reference, which is that Doug is who he says he is, and he can prove that through verifiable credentials. And so that's not FedEx or UPS or somebody trying to convince the U.S. government of the inherent goodness of these emerging technologies. That's tangible effort that they're working on right now. And they also get the fact that they can't do this alone. So they also reach out to EU, they reach out to UK, they reach out to others from that point of view, so that they are also starting to have this common language around interoperability, around standards, around where this is going. The final comment I'll make is that anybody who says what's going to happen with the government, whatever the case may be, it kind of implies or assumes a static environment. And this environment is anything but static. These emerging technologies are fundamentally changing almost everything we've ever done. And I know we're going to talk about digital a little bit further.
I was going to go exactly to that because I can well imagine in your business that there's friction all over the place, but some of the friction has to do with moving goods across various different kinds of boundaries, borders. And that as more and more businesses digitalize and we have these more robust kinds of systems, and we have IoT devices, and we've got AI devices. Governments want to make sure that goods going back and forth are compliant to safety regulations, are compliant to taxation regulations, are discriminating against criminal operations and those sorts of things. And yet they want those goods to move with as little friction as possible because that friction incurs cost on the entire economy. You talked about credentials. I think there's also this issue that we can now have bonding or IoT locks on various different containers that can be pre-cleared because you can demonstrate they haven't been tampered with, and that there's ways of having a truck arrive at a border in a digital twin version ahead of time so that it can be pre-cleared so that when it does arrive, the transition from one jurisdiction to another is very quick and has relatively little friction. As our whole world and our whole economy becomes much more digitalized, do you see these issues we've been talking about standards and coopetition, do you see this becoming even a bigger and more important, more fundamental part of our business landscape?
I'm going to get on my little soapbox for just a second here, because I think this might be the most important piece of what we're talking about today. I think that the word digital might be the most transformative word we use today in this discussion. And so let me set it up, if I could, briefly. For all of human time, literally back thousands of years BCE, when the concept of trade was first invented, we have used some type of physical item as a proxy for trust. I made a tapestry, or I had some oils or something 3000 BCE, but I didn't handle the transportation. So you had camels across the desert, or you had a canoe or a boat or something down a river or something, but you had a middleman. You had somebody that was moving it, and then once they got there, they could sell it. But there was this proxy of trust concept so that Doug could get his money. Dale's moving this for Doug, and yet there's these pieces here. Those physical items started with things like clay tablets, and then papyrus, and then in recent centuries, paper. But we're right now at the moment in all of human history when we can say with confidence that the future of global commerce is digital. We're back to that open foundational layer and proprietary layer. But when we digitize the data elements for shipping, we now create that digital twin that you just now mentioned, where I know that Doug is a trusted shipper. He's shipping into the United States. We can reduce that to items. Digitizing is one thing. Once those are digitized, we will then be able to digitalize processes. My brain connects dots. I've spent decades on process improvement, quality strategy. I understand processes like breathing. We're all good at something, and that happens to be what I'm good at. I get it from that point of view. But when we can digitalize these processes, it's going to completely transform global commerce. So right now, it's all based on paper. What document did you use? It's a commercial invoice. It's a bill of lading. It's all those kinds of things. All of our processes are based on that at this point in time, and you build it accordingly. Well, you gave me a document. I retyped it. Hopefully, I didn't make some errors, but there's all this friction, and it's got to slow it down, got to wait till it gets to the border, got to do all those kinds of things. Once we've freed that up and we simply know who Doug is, Doug has credentials, he's a trusted shipper, it's 5,000 shipments, he ships the same thing to Dale every month, we know it, we got it. I mean, U.S. Customs and the other customs entities around the world are going to use the same emerging technologies that FedEx or somebody else will use. Machine learning, AI, all these analytics and optimization tools. They're going to get to predictive models. They're going to get, what will happen. They're going to get to prescriptive models. How can we make it happen? But this whole digital thing is the future, and it's going to completely transform. Once we get to digital, then we can cascade that down into all the other emerging technologies like blockchain, like Web3 based issues, like all kinds of other and things we haven't even thought of yet from that point of view. But once we've made that move to digital, it's all going to be databases. It's going to be on the cloud. It's going to be analytics. It's going to be all those things. And that's why peer-to-peer technologies like blockchain and Web3 based items are going to be another reason why they're going to be so disruptive, because if you need a ride and I've got a car, then maybe one of the ride sharing apps might be helpful, but they're going to carve out some percentage right off the top as a profit layer. If you and I can find each other and do so in a trusted environment, a digital and a trusted environment like what we're talking about now, we may no longer need that person that sits between supply and demand and introduces the two of us for a price. I can't really emphasize enough how important this moment is in time. And it gets to global commerce, but it also gets everywhere else. It's not just global. I mean, it's finances, it's movement, it's all kinds of things from that point of view. Once we digitize things, and then we really rethink these processes that were originally built around paper or other manual handoffs, could be a currency. There's lots of things here from that point of view. It's really a very different future. And so a 10-year-old today or a newborn today, that's the world they're going to grow up in, and that's all they're going to know.
Let's grab these two big ideas. I completely agree. Digitalization really changes everything. And you also kind of alluded to the AI thing, which we'll discuss in just a little more detail in a second. But when I was researching the BRI paper on Web3 in the pharmaceutical industry, we had a chat and we were talking about some of the challenges in the pharmaceutical supply chain and the cold chain, and specifically around pediatric oncology drugs. And some of the challenges around both privacy and the introduction of fraudulent substitutes into the supply chain and the terrible effects that has on the real world of the people that are in desperate need of some of these drugs, or the stuff that they were waiting for has been diverted by pirates that are selling it on the black market, et cetera. And these are real, tangible problems with very real, tangible impacts on very vulnerable populations. As you think through some of the effects of digitalization on the backplane of supply and logistics for these kinds of supply chains, and even the new increasingly important AI component that can discover patterns and alert us to things that humans, with the way that we reasoned, we're very good at reductive reasoning, but we're not very good at holistic reasoning. Can you talk us through what's a tangible example of the confluence, the convergence of these various different technologies that are allowing us to kind of rethink the way that we build and administrate these kinds of supply chains?
I want to start by saying that one of the real hard lessons that I've had to learn, I've spent much of my career in processes. So when we figure out that there's something that we need to improve and we all figure out what that is and we all agree on that, we can move forward pretty quickly from that point of view. The hard lesson I've learned is that there's a lot of people in the world that don't want what we're talking about to happen. Right? Their business models are opposite of that. I've got kids to put through school. What do you mean I'm going to shut this down and do this and do this? So That's a reality that we have to just accept, this kind of gravitational pull back to the current, the status quo. That was a hard lesson for me to learn because I'm kind of an optimist and an idealist. It's like, wait a second, this is a better way. Let's do this. What are we waiting for? And yet the world out there is built on the current processes. Essentially, it's a Web 2 world, right? And we're talking about Web 3 concepts here. One of the examples I used several years ago, I haven't thought about it for a while, but I'll use it now in response to your question, is these data elements are also going to start aligning. My data model talks to your data model, which does all kinds of things. So now we can help you with your supply chain. Doug's supply chain looks like this, and some of these models might help you think about that differently, or place your warehouses differently, or your shipping models, or your inventories, or whatever the case may be, right? And that's not insignificant. Companies can do that themselves. Other companies can sell those services to other companies. There's a whole model there from that point of view. You mentioned IoT, so Internet of Things devices. That would be a sensor of some type. That's going to have a huge impact on global commerce. The example I would use would be med devices, like hip joints and ankle joints and those kinds of things. Once we know where everything is, once we get to sensors that are increasingly inexpensive, increasingly common, and essentially kind of a commodity, then you're going to have both live scanning, cell pulse, or maybe passive scanning, or whatever the case may be. But once we know where everything is, let's just say I can help you know where all of your inventory is right now, every bit of it. Whether that's an Xbox in a Walmart store, where we say we have 4, but we can only find 2. Well, once you get to that level, you have 2. One's in receiving and one's at checkout, or whatever the case may be. But once you know where everything is, you won't need as much. So that now starts impacting inventory levels. It impacts warehousing. It impacts working capital. It impacts all kinds of things. So the example I'll use, back to your question, is the med device company on the horizon. The next time a major storm, a polar vortex, I think is what they called it a few years ago, hits Chicago or Toronto, or pick a location, the data model that the med device company has also connects to the weather model that the weather service has. And they know that by the time that they get to a certain amount of snow or ice or certain conditions, a certain number of people are going to fall and break their ankle. So they calmly move the ankle device into the surgical suite 2 hours before I fell and broke my ankle. I've connected a few dots here, and I might have stretched a little bit, but conceptually, that's the kind of real world application that these data models will have. It's not just about me having my own data model or you having yours or me helping you with yours. It's about these models all starting to connect and really starting to gain insight, analytics, and optimization. And there's probably lots of other examples we could give, but that's one that kind of gets people's attention.
Learned that dismissing things as being fanciful is foolhardy, because there's so many things that we take for granted today that not very long ago were completely fanciful. So I totally believe that those kinds of scenarios will become commonplace. And this idea that you're suggesting that if we know where everything is, because we're ledgering it, because we're measuring things, that in fact the active supply chain, the goods in transit, actually become part of the overall inventory. In fact, the inventory that is in suppliers, that is somewhere else in the supply chain, becomes inventory, even if it's not completely assembled, but it becomes inventory at some point in time. And if you're smart enough about it, you can do high quality prediction, then you can start incorporating that virtual or goods in transit as part of your inventory planning process, which is a really wild thought.
Let me just add another fanciful thing. I believe they will also be tokenized. So not only every point you just now made, I agree with, but let's add one more layer to that, which is you could also collateralize it. You could also prove that I have this in my inventory, and therefore there's other things I can do with that, because right now you can't do anything with that money once that's out there. And there's a lot of money that's just sitting out in global commerce. A lot of people smarter than me on these points, but collateralizing that, having the ability to prove what you say you have, allows you to do many more things from a business point of view.
That is a really great point, because it really does change trade finance, and it trades insurance and hedging positions and all kinds of stuff that puts working capital into the system that is currently locked away in distributed inventory just because we don't have the knowledge and awareness of where the stuff is and the confidence that it does represent real collateral. That's a really interesting point. You can't read an article or look up your news app any day without being completely jaw-dropping amazed at the latest innovations going on around AI. I think it's pretty obvious that AI is going to be pervasively impactful. And earlier in this discussion, you were talking about those wise people and academics who crafted the essential building blocks of the original internet, and how in the case of the next generation of the internet, the stateful internet that is running on top of blockchain, that it happened in a much more open, multi-company, open innovation space. It was a little less academically and prescriptively driven. And there's both goodness and badness to that sort of approach, but for better or for worse, it's the reality. As we're looking forward to AI, which I suspect is going to have an awful lot of impact in your industry, especially around prediction, even the scenarios you were talking about storm effects and injuries and needing certain inventories in certain places predictively. As we think about this coopetition landscape, and at the same time, the reality that there is this radically new technology that is emerging incredibly quickly, and there's lots of questions about standardization and even about ethics. How do you see applying the lessons you've learned from many, many years involved in coopetition and standards organizations? How do you see applying those lessons to this new AI space? Is it easy to apply those lessons, or is there something distinctive about this AI space that's going to present us with some challenges?
Well, I think it's all of those things. You and I could probably have a 5-hour conversation just on this one question. So I'll narrow it down. I'll kind of play devil's advocate for just 1 second. It's kind of my coopetition reference. It's kind of a weird word, like where did that come from? But it kind of stuck with me. I have described, again, with a wink, to some extent is like a blender. So you are a chef, I'm a chef, somebody's a chef. You're working with raw materials, you're working with vegetables or potatoes or whatever example you want to use from that point of view of the materials that you're using. You're working on it by hand, and now somebody's handed you a blender and said, okay, here it is. Well, part of the issue is that if you just simply put your potatoes and your vegetables or whatever the case may be in your blender and punch the button, it's the same raw material. It didn't give you anything different than what you already had, right? It does something different. It makes it easier. But the key point I'm trying to make is the source materials, the raw materials. And so early on, a year or so ago, when ChatGPT came out, it's dramatically changed everything. One of the first things you would talk about is, I want to use ChatGPT, and somebody would caution you. They'd kind of shake their finger at you and kind of lower their head and go, now, Dale, they don't know where the source of some of that stuff is, so be careful, which is true, right? So that's the point I was making about the blender. It certainly is going to do things that we've never thought of before, and we're still figuring that out. And every business who is working on this right now has got lots and lots of resources, from programming to everything you can think of, right? To the analytics around Doug's supply chain that somebody might do for them, or Doug himself. I mean, it's a massive game changer. My focus back at that International Space Station level is that it's just one of the tools. It is just a tool, and some of the same common things are going to have to exist for it, as we've been talking about, which is you've got to get to interoperability, you've got to get to standards, you got to get to those kinds of things. And yes, it'd be like using blockchain within the 4 walls of FedEx. It wouldn't do any good, right? So there's some use that you can do within the 4 walls of any company with AI. There's probably a lot actually early on from that point of view. But as it continues to mature, it's going to be those where we can connect to others, where we can do those kinds of things. So I have said for probably over a year that blockchain could be the killer app for AI, because it'll blend up your raw materials, but it doesn't tell you the source. It doesn't tell you where that potato came from, or it doesn't tell you where the romaine lettuce came from, or whatever the case may be. And so where provenance and authenticity of that source data is critical, I think that's 2 emerging technologies that will have a wonderful marriage We'll see if I'm right or if I'm wrong from that point of view. But people have been trying to figure out what's the killer app for blockchain for a long time. And it is around provenance and authenticity. But AI certainly takes it to a whole new level. And yet, we want to know that when I spin up that AI, when I do that work on the AI, if I don't know the source, then there's some fuzziness to the results. So I think as these things mature, maybe there's a hierarchy there. Maybe you start by putting certain data on a blockchain that then is used by the AI tools to do certain things, and maybe not 100% of everything. And then maybe over some longer period of time, it's essentially everything. We'll see, but AI certainly is the thing right now. And yet we do have to be concerned about source material. I was at a Blockchain Research Institute conference, and I was having a conversation with a fellow member in the medical field, and he was a CIO, and one of his comments was that in a brand new position, one of his first efforts was, I need to map my data supply chain. That just stopped me. I'm just like, wait a second, map your, let me make sure I understand the words there. You're going to map your data supply chain. He goes, I need to know where the source of that data is coming from. I need to go the upstream side of things. And so I think that's part of the answer here, whether that's in logistics or transportation or broader in the global commerce space.
My mind is kind of blown here.
Yeah, mine was too.
My last question to you was going to be about how you see these technologies changing the shipping logistics business and what role Coopetition is going to play in that evolution. And you've touched on a bunch there. I mean, the idea that shipping and logistics could take on some of the provenance tracking responsibilities that are so important to various industries like aviation, healthcare, and pharmaceuticals, that it can take on things like the data provenance issues, where all the data comes from and whether there's inherent biases in systems. But there's so many possibilities. How do you see your business space evolving and being impacted by these technologies? And what role and how important will this concept of coopetition be as part of this evolution?
I think I'm speaking not at a company level, but at an industry level, we are custodians. You're shipping something from point A to point B, and my industry is the one that is going to move that. So I won't have your quality control data for that pediatric oncology drug that you talked about. I'm not going to have that. You have that. And yet these technologies can create this true chain of custody for data, for physical movement through IoT devices and other ways. And so not only can we get it from point A to point B and prove that that has happened, we've kept it at the right temperature, the right humidity, no shock, no light, all those kinds of things from that point of view. But that ultimate chain of custody will connect not only from your point of view, maybe through contracts that I'm required to do certain things, and you can now prove that with authority through smart contracts, through things like that. But ultimately, it will go upstream. We're going to start with some basic transaction like point A to point B across a border with a sensor or something like that. But ultimately, it's going to go back upstream, way up to the raw materials. And that takes you into things like forced labor scenarios where you'll now be able to have proof. Where did this come from? And can you prove it? I mean, there's a number of these things. And they'll start slow, but little by little, to be one of those where you don't hear much about it. And all of a sudden, you reach a tipping point pretty quickly. And again, I think AI will get there quicker than that. But these are the kinds of things. It's just data. From my point of view, it's just data, and now we're going to digitize that data. And once it's been digitized, we can digitalize the processes, and then all bets are off. It's a completely different global commerce for consumers. I'll be able to know that newborn today may want to know where the coffee bean came from in the cup of coffee they're drinking. They're going to have that. They're going to want to know that the denim that they've just purchased is sustainable. They're going to want all kinds of things from that point of view. So we've now connected it back over to the ESG efforts and many other efforts as well. I mean, it's all going to come together. The data is going to allow us to do things that we've never even considered before in a much more direct Doug to Dale manner, and not going through 4 intermediaries that got it between Doug and Dale.
The tokenization of economic externalities is going to put a whole new layer on understanding what a good is and what its price is and how consumers make decisions about consuming them, and figuring out how to layer all of that on top of the supply logistics chains are a fascinating question. It's going to be so exciting to see how our society and economy writ large is going to evolve, but the role that shipping and logistics are going to play in this evolving world is going to be absolutely fascinating to watch. And I, for one, am very glad that people like you are at FedEx and that you have the attitudes that you've shared with us today. And I'm pretty optimistic about how all this may play out. So thank you so much for your time, Dale. You've been incredibly generous, and thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. And thank all of you for joining us today for this episode of W3B Talks. You can find out more information about FedEx at fedex.com. You can also find more information about this topic, including Dale's paper on Coopetition, at blockchainresearchinstitute.org. And while you're there, please consider subscribing to our newsletter. I'm your host, Doug Heinzman. We hope that you've enjoyed this episode and that you will join us for our next episode of W3B Talks.